Picture this: a woman in a floral dress boards a train in occupied France, carrying a wicker basket filled with fresh bread. She smiles at the German checkpoint guard. He waves her through. What he doesn't know, what he can't know, is that inside those loaves, baked just hours before, are microfilm documents detailing Wehrmacht troop movements, documents that will reach London within 48 hours, documents that will save thousands of Allied lives. This isn't a scene from a Hollywood thriller. This is history, real history, the kind they don't teach in schools. We've all heard the stories: the dashing SOE agents parachuting into darkness, the wireless operators tapping out coded messages in attic rooms. The official narrative of World War II espionage is one of trained professionals, military discipline, and government sanction. It's a narrative that's comfortable, familiar, and fundamentally incomplete. Because here's what they don't tell you: some of the most devastating intelligence operations of the Second World War weren't run by trained spies at all. They were masterminded by housewives, by bakers, by train conductors and postal workers and shopkeepers, ordinary people who decided that occupation wasn't acceptable, people who had no handler, no training, no backup plan, people who invented their own networks from scratch and operated completely off the books. Why haven't you heard their stories? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you understand resistance, courage, and the hidden machinery that actually wins wars. Let me paint you the accepted picture first. September 1939. War erupts across Europe. Within months, Britain establishes the Special Operations Executive, the SOE. Their mission, in Churchill's words, to set Europe ablaze. We know their story. Agents trained in explosives, wireless operations, silent killing, dropped behind enemy lines with cyanide pills and false papers. Heroes, absolutely. But here's the question nobody asks: what about everyone else? What about the millions of ordinary Europeans living under occupation who weren't recruited, weren't trained, weren't even on London's radar? Did they just wait, accept their fate? The answer is electrifying. They didn't wait, they organized. But here's the twist: they organized themselves. Independent networks emerged across occupied Europe like mushrooms after rain. Networks that had nothing to do with official channels. Networks that invented their own rules, created their own methods, took risks that would make trained agents blanch. And here's the uncomfortable truth the official histories don't want to address. Sometimes these amateur networks outperformed the professionals. Sometimes a fishmonger moving intelligence through his delivery routes proved more valuable than an entire SOE circuit. Sometimes the person nobody suspected, the elderly librarian, the teenage courier, the parish priest, achieved what highly trained operatives couldn't. Why does this make military historians uncomfortable? Because it challenges the fundamental assumption that resistance requires official sanction, that espionage is the domain of professionals, that ordinary people can't be trusted with matters of war. But they were trusted by necessity, and they delivered beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Let me show you how. Consider the problem from their perspective. You're a Dutch postal clerk in 1941. You've intercepted German military correspondence that could be vital to Allied intelligence. But you have no training, no radio, no contact with London, no idea how espionage actually works. What do? You improvise. And that improvisation, replicated across 1,000 civilian networks, became one of the war's most remarkable phenomena. Take the cross-border merchants. Before the war, traders moved goods between France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland. When occupation came, those trade routes didn't disappear, they adapted. A wine merchant from Bordeaux still needed to deliver to restaurants in Brussels. A textile dealer still had clients in Amsterdam. The Germans needed the economy functioning, so they issued passes, established checkpoints, created a system. And the merchants exploited every crack in that system. Wine barrels became hollow intelligence containers. Fabric bolts were rolled around microfilm. Account ledgers contained codes in their margins. These weren't sophisticated spy techniques. They were adaptations of ordinary smuggling methods that had existed for centuries. But applied to military intelligence, they became devastatingly effective. One Belgian lace merchant, we'll call her Marie, though that wasn't her real name, moved intelligence between Brussels and Paris for 18 months. Her method? She incorporated codes directly into the lace patterns themselves. Different stitches represented different letters. A trained eye could read German fortification locations in the supposedly decorative borders of a tablecloth. Think about the audacity of that for a moment. You're sitting across from a German officer at a checkpoint. He's examining your goods. In his hands is a piece of lace containing the exact positions of the artillery batteries he commands. He's holding the information that will destroy those batteries, and he's looking at it, turning it over, complimenting the craftsmanship, and letting you pass. How did they live with that tension? How did anyone maintain composure when discovery meant torture and execution? The answer reveals something profound about human psychology under occupation. But we'll get there. First, you need to understand just how creative these networks became. The trains were perhaps the most brilliant civilian network of all. Think about it. Trains moved constantly through occupied territory. Train crews crossed borders, entered military zones, accessed stations that ordinary civilians couldn't approach. They were everywhere, yet virtually invisible to scrutiny. Who pays attention to a conductor, a porter, a maintenance worker? The railway networks knew this, and they weaponized it. In France, the cheminots, the railway workers, developed their own resistance network completely independent of official circuits. They had one enormous advantage. They understood the German logistics system intimately because they ran it. Every military transport, every supply train, every troop movement passed through their hands. So they documented everything. Timetables were memorized and passed along communication chains. Manifests were photographed using cameras hidden in lunchboxes. Station masters kept detailed logs of German cargo, noting which units were being supplied, what equipment they carried, where they were heading. But here's where it gets remarkable. These railway workers weren't just passive observers. They became active saboteurs, manipulating the very system they operated. A wrong coupling here, a misdirected freight car there, paperwork that mysteriously goes missing, sending military supplies to the wrong destination, and all the while, information flowing back through their underground network to resistance cells and eventually to Allied intelligence. One conductor, let's call him Jean, ran intelligence for 32 months. 32 months of daily checkpoint crossings, 32 months of German passengers, German cargo, German suspicion. Every trip could be his last. Every interaction with German transport officers was a tightrope walk. What kind of person can sustain that level of operational stress for nearly 3 years? We're about to find out. Because the psychological dimension of civilian espionage reveals truths about human nature that go far beyond the war itself, let's talk about the how more specifically. Because the ingenuity of these civilian networks rivals anything the professional spy agencies developed. In fact, sometimes it exceeded it. Women's networks were particularly ingenious. Why? Because occupation forces consistently underestimated women. That blind spot became a weapon. Knitting circles became intelligence analysis groups. Patterns weren't just patterns, they were codes. Different stitches, different colors, different sequences all meant something. A woman could sit in a cafe, knitting, while German officers drank and talked, and she'd be encoding everything she heard into the scarf growing in her lap. Laundry services were another brilliant cover. A widow running a laundry in occupied Belgium washed German officers' uniforms. She found things in their pockets, documents, photographs, letters. She'd carefully photograph them with a camera hidden in her washing equipment, return the originals to the pockets, and pass the intelligence on through her network. For months, she literally cleaned the evidence of German military operations while simultaneously documenting them. Here's what's extraordinary. The most effective spycraft looked exactly like ordinary life. That's what made it undetectable. You can train an agent in covert photography, dead drops, brush passes, but you can't train someone to look like they belong somewhere they've belonged their entire life. That authenticity was armor, impenetrable armor. A Dutch baker wasn't pretending to be a baker, he was one. When he chatted with German soldiers buying bread, there was no performance. When he made his deliveries to restaurants and hotels, no one questioned his presence. And when he arrived at the cafe that served as a resistance hub, carrying microfilm hidden in hollowed-out rolling pins, It looked exactly like what it was: a baker making a delivery. The best cover is no cover at all. It's just your life, repurposed. But how do you repurpose your life without losing your mind? This is where we need to pause and consider something that rarely appears in espionage histories: the crushing psychological weight of sustained deception. Imagine living two lives simultaneously. In one, you're exactly who you appear to be: the postal worker, the nurse, the shopkeeper. You go through the motions, you smile at customers, you attend church, you comment on the weather, everything normal. In the other life, you're committing acts that, if discovered, will result in your torture and execution. You're carrying intelligence that could alter the course of battles. You're maintaining contacts with resistance networks, you're making decisions that affect thousands of lives, and you can never let anyone see the second life, not your neighbors, not your family, sometimes not even your spouse. Here's the question that haunts me. How many of these civilian operatives cracked under the pressure? How many made mistakes born of exhaustion, terror, or simple human frailty? The official histories don't record those numbers. Success stories survive. Failures often disappear into mass graves. One account from a French schoolteacher who survived the war describes the experience as living inside a glass vessel that could shatter at any moment. Every interaction was potential exposure. Every knock on the door could be the Gestapo. Sleep became impossible. Trust became impossible. The only thing that kept you functioning was the mission itself. And sometimes even that wasn't enough. Stay with me, because understanding why these people accepted such impossible burdens reveals something essential about resistance itself. Let's address the fundamental question: why? Why would ordinary people risk everything to become amateur spies? What possible motivation justifies the terror, the danger, the likelihood of a brutal death? The easy answer is ideology, patriotism, hatred of fascism. And yes, those factors mattered. But they're not the whole story. In fact, they're often not even the main story. Talk to survivors, read their memoirs, their testimonies, and you find something more primal. You find mathematics, personal, intimate mathematics. A Belgian shopkeeper begins smuggling intelligence after German soldiers destroy his neighbor's home, not because of abstract political principles, but because he watched a family he'd known for 20 years become refugees overnight. The equation was simple: this cannot stand. A Dutch nurse joins a resistance network after treating wounded civilians from a German reprisal action. She'd bandaged children, elderly people, pregnant women. The injuries weren't from combat, they were from systematic brutality. Her calculation: if I have access to German medical facilities, I have access to intelligence. Use it. What's fascinating is how many of these decisions came from a single moment, not a gradual radicalization, but an instant when the occupation became personal, when abstract politics crystallized into concrete fury. A French railroad worker discovers his cousin was executed for minor black market trading. Suddenly, passive observation isn't enough. The trains he operates become intelligence-gathering platforms. A Polish teacher watches German soldiers burn books in the town square, books she'd taught from, books her students loved. That evening, she contacts resistance networks she'd previously avoided. Her classroom becomes a dead-drop location. The trigger wasn't ideology, it was human connection, family, community. The visceral understanding that remaining passive was complicity. But here's what the histories often miss: these decisions weren't made in isolation. They were made within networks of relationships that predated the war, networks that became the architecture of resistance itself. One of the most remarkable aspects of civilian espionage networks is how they emerged from existing social structures. They weren't imposed from above, they grew from below, along the lines of trust that already existed. Consider a typical French village in 1941. The baker knows everyone. The postmaster knows everyone's business. The priest hears confessions. The doctor enters every home. The schoolteacher influences the next generation. These weren't random individuals, they were the connective tissue of community life. When resistance formed, it followed those existing pathways. The baker, who delivered bread to the same families for decades, could expand his route to include new customers. Really, resistance safe houses. The postmaster, who already handled mail, could intercept, copy, and redistribute German correspondence. The priest, who moved freely between parishes, could carry messages and coordinate activities across regions. Here's the strategic brilliance. These networks were nearly impossible to penetrate. Professional spy rings could be infiltrated. All it took was one turned agent, one intercepted communication. But how do you infiltrate a community that's existed for generations? How do you fake the kind of relationships built over decades? You can't. Which meant civilian networks had a natural security advantage that no amount of training could replicate. But that security came with a dark mirror image. When networks were discovered, the reprisals were catastrophic. The Gestapo didn't just arrest the operatives, they destroyed entire communities. Everyone connected, everyone suspected, everyone who might have known something. The stakes weren't individual, they were collective. When you joined a civilian resistance network, you weren't just risking yourself. You were potentially condemning your neighbors, your family, everyone you'd ever known. How do you make that choice? Let me tell you about someone who did. Her name was Sophia. At least, that's what we'll call her. Her real identity remains protected even now, 70 years after the war. Sophia was a seamstress in occupied Poland, 26 years old when Germany invaded. No political background, no training, no particular ideology beyond a general sense that occupation was wrong. She became one of the most effective civilian intelligence operators in her region. Sophia's cover was perfect because it was genuine. She ran a small shop, taking in mending and alterations. German officers stationed in the area needed their uniforms maintained. They brought them to Sophia because she was skilled and discreet. They trusted her because she'd been there for years, was polite, seemed harmless. What they didn't know, every uniform she touched was searched, documents photographed, insignia recorded, pocket contents noted. She maintained detailed logs of which officers visited, when, what units they represented. She tracked promotions, transfers, equipment changes. From her small shop, she built a comprehensive picture of German military organization in her sector. For 18 months, Sophia's intelligence flowed to resistance networks and eventually to Allied command. Her information contributed to at least 3 major partisan operations. It helped route supply convoys around German patrols. It identified collaborators within the local population. And then in August 1943, someone talked, we don't know who. A captured partisan, tortured beyond endurance. A neighbor who noticed something suspicious. A German counterintelligence breakthrough. It doesn't matter. The Gestapo came for Sophia. What happened next appears in testimony from survivors. Sophia was arrested, interrogated for 6 days. She revealed nothing, not her contacts, not her methods, not the extent of her network. On the 7th day, she was executed in the town square, 28 years old. The Gestapo made her execution public as a warning. Here's what they didn't anticipate. It had the opposite effect. Within weeks, Sophia's network reconstituted under new leadership. Her sacrifice didn't end the resistance, it intensified it. Why am I telling you this story? Because Sophia wasn't unique. There were thousands of Sophias, men and women whose names appear in no official records, whose sacrifice is commemorated by no monuments, who died protecting networks that history has largely forgotten. But their impact, that echoes through every military history of the war, whether those histories acknowledge it or not. Let me show you exactly how. Now we get to the question that matters. Did any of this make a difference? Were these civilian networks actually strategically significant, or are they just compelling footnotes to the real story of professional espionage? The answer is going to surprise you. By mid-1943, Allied intelligence was drowning in information. Official SOE circuits, ultra-intercepts, reconnaissance flights, data poured in from multiple sources. The problem wasn't quantity, it was quality and specificity. Knowing German strategic intentions from decoded transmissions was valuable, but knowing exactly where specific units were positioned, what equipment they had, what their morale was like, that granular, ground-level intelligence was harder to obtain. That's where civilian networks became irreplaceable. Let me give you a specific example. June 1944. The Allied invasion of Normandy is days away. High Command has intelligence about German defensive positions, but it's incomplete. They know there are artillery batteries covering the beaches, but exact positions and firing angles are unclear. This isn't academic. It's the difference between thousands of lives saved or lost. A civilian network in Normandy, postal workers, farmers, shopkeepers, provides the breakthrough. They've been documenting German fortifications for months, not through dramatic raids or risky infiltrations, but through simple, daily observation. A postman notices new concrete being poured. A farmer sees artillery being positioned while working his fields. A shopkeeper overhears German engineers discussing firing ranges. Individually, these observations mean little. Collectively, synthesized through the network, they produce precise intelligence maps that reach Allied command just days before the invasion. Those maps directly influenced where naval bombardment concentrated, where airborne troops landed, how beach approach routes were planned. The result? Specific German positions were neutralized before they could inflict maximum casualties. We'll never know exactly how many Allied lives were saved by that intelligence. Hundreds? Thousands? But we know the invasion succeeded partly because ordinary French civilians spent months watching, documenting, and risking everything to get that information to the right people. That's not a footnote. That's strategic significance. And this pattern repeated across theaters and campaigns. In the Netherlands, a network of barge operators documented every German military shipment moving through the Canal system. That intelligence revealed supply route vulnerabilities that partisan groups exploited, strangling German logistics in critical sectors. In Norway, civilian dock workers tracked U-boat movements in and out of fjord bases. Their intelligence helped the Royal Navy coordinate anti-submarine operations that significantly reduced U-boat effectiveness in the North Atlantic. In Italy, railway employees provided detailed manifests of German troop and equipment movements north through the peninsula. That intelligence informed Allied tactical decisions during the Italian campaign, allowing commanders to anticipate German reinforcements and repositioning. Here's what's remarkable. Most military histories credit these intelligence coups to partisan networks or resistance forces, without acknowledging that many of those networks were civilian-organized and civilian-operated. The housewife who coded intelligence into shopping lists, the postal clerk who photographed German correspondence, the teacher who organized student couriers. They're lumped together under generic labels that obscure their actual nature. Why does this matter? Because it perpetuates a dangerous myth that resistance requires official sanction and professional training, that ordinary people can't significantly impact major conflicts, that you need to be special, elite, trained, selected to make a difference. These civilian networks prove the opposite. They prove that strategic impact can come from anywhere, that courage doesn't require a uniform, that sometimes the most devastating intelligence comes not from the dramatic parachute insertion, but from the baker who pays attention. But there's another dimension to their impact that goes beyond military significance. These networks change the nature of occupation itself. Think about occupation from the German perspective for a moment. The theory was straightforward. Overwhelming military force plus tight control of information equals compliant population. Suppress organized resistance, control communications, and the occupied territories become manageable. It was a reasonable theory. It had worked in other contexts, but it failed in Western Europe, and civilian intelligence networks are a significant reason why. Here's the strategic effect. Every civilian potentially being an intelligence operative fundamentally altered occupation dynamics. German forces couldn't distinguish between genuinely compliant civilians and network operatives. The shopkeeper you bought from yesterday might be documenting your unit's equipment. The nurse treating your injuries might be memorizing your division insignia. The train conductor checking your papers might be noting your travel patterns. This created operational paranoia. German units became increasingly isolated, trusting only each other. That isolation made them less effective. Units that don't integrate with local populations lose access to ground-level intelligence. They miss threats, they fail to anticipate resistance actions, they operate blind. Occupation requires collaboration. You need local workers to keep infrastructure running, local merchants to supply goods, local administrators to manage daily governance. But what happens when you can't trust any of them? When every interaction might be an intelligence-gathering opportunity for the enemy, you get a system that corrodes from within. German forces in Western Europe never achieved the stability they needed because they could never establish trust. And that's partly because civilian intelligence networks made trust impossible. One German officer's diary, captured after the war, includes this remarkable passage from 1943. "We control the streets but know nothing of what happens behind closed doors. Every French family could be sheltering resistance. Every shop could be a meeting point. We are occupiers in appearance only. In truth, we are surrounded." That's the psychological victory of civilian networks. They turned occupation into siege. But the impact goes even deeper. These networks created templates, models for resistance that outlasted the war itself. Let's get specific about Tradecraft, because the methods developed by civilian networks represent genuine innovation in intelligence gathering. Some techniques were so effective that post-war intelligence agencies incorporated them into official doctrine. One of the most elegant systems was what some networks called chained observation. No single person gathered complete intelligence. Instead, multiple civilians observed fragments, which were assembled by coordinators who never entered the field. Example: a German convoy passes through a town. The baker notes the time and approximate number of vehicles. The postman, on his route, identifies the unit markings. The schoolteacher, watching from her classroom window, counts personnel. The mechanic, approached to repair a broken-down truck, photographs the equipment type. None of these individuals does anything obviously suspicious. None gathers complete intelligence. But when the baker mentions the convoy to the postman, who mentions it to the teacher, who passes it to the mechanic, who delivers everything to the coordinator, suddenly you have time, location, unit identity, strength, and equipment type. Complete tactical intelligence from fragments that individually mean nothing. This method was nearly unbreakable. Capture one person, and they genuinely don't know much. They can't reveal the full network because they're only aware of their immediate contacts. The coordinator, who assembles complete intelligence, never appears in the field, so they're nearly impossible to identify. Professional spy agencies had used cutouts and compartmentalization for years, but civilian networks refined it to an art form. They lacked the resources and training to operate any other way. Necessity bred innovation. Another ingenious development, the innocent courier system. Networks realized that certain people could move between locations with almost no suspicion. Children particularly, elderly people, priests and nurses, the disabled, people that occupation forces unconsciously dismissed as non-threatening. A 10-year-old child delivering a basket of eggs to her grandmother isn't suspicious. What if that basket contains microfilm hidden in hollowed-out eggshells? What if the grandmother is actually a network coordinator? You've just moved intelligence across German checkpoints using a courier so innocent she genuinely doesn't know what she's carrying. Ruthless, perhaps effective, devastatingly so. Civilian networks also developed increasingly sophisticated codes, often more practical than official systems. Professional codes required training, codebooks, equipment. Civilian codes used everyday objects and patterns. One Dutch network used flower arrangements, different flowers, different arrangements, placed in shop windows, all conveying information about German activities. A vase of tulips meant troop movements expected. Daffodils indicated all clear. Mixed arrangements provided numerical codes. German soldiers walked past these windows daily, seeing nothing but floral decorations. A Belgian network used children's chalk drawings on sidewalks and walls. Seemingly random doodles actually marked safe houses, meeting times, danger warnings. German patrols would walk past, maybe complain about children defacing property, but never recognize the drawings as communication systems. The brilliance of these codes, they looked exactly like what they were supposed to be, not disguised, not hidden, just normal, and that normality made them invisible. The most sophisticated civilian code I've encountered was developed by a network of librarians in occupied France. They used library cataloging systems, the mundane organizational tools of their profession, as intelligence codes. Book requests became operational orders. Catalog numbers indicated coordinates. Overdue notices signaled danger. The entire intelligence operation ran through a public library system that German authorities never thought to scrutinize. Think about the audacity. German officers actually used these libraries. They'd walk in, request books, use the reading rooms, never knowing the catalogue cards they browsed past contained encoded intelligence about their own units. How do you defeat an enemy who weaponizes the utterly mundane? The answer? You don't. Not without recognizing that everyone around you might be an operative. And that level of paranoia makes effective occupation impossible. We need to talk about failure, because not all these networks succeeded. Not every operation concluded with intelligence delivered and operatives safe. Some collapsed catastrophically, with consequences that rippled through entire communities. Network compromise usually followed predictable patterns. Someone talked under interrogation. A routine document check revealed something inconsistent. A new member was actually a Gestapo plant. Sometimes it was simpler. Bad luck, wrong place, random inspection that uncovered hidden materials.
Once compromise began, it spread fast. The Gestapo were thorough, brutally, methodically thorough. They'd arrest one person, extract names under torture, arrest those people, extract more names. A single compromise could unravel months or years of network building in days.
The Prosper network in France is a famous example from official SOE operations, but civilian networks faced similar catastrophes. In 1943, a civilian network in Belgium, mostly postal workers, was completely destroyed. 37 arrests over 5 days, systematic interrogations, mass executions. The trigger was almost mundane. A postal clerk made a minor procedural error in forwarding mail. Just a small inconsistency in routine paperwork, but a suspicious German administrator noticed. One investigation led to another. The clerk broke under torture. The network collapsed. What happened to those 37 people? We know from tribunal records. 12 were executed immediately. 9 died during interrogation. 16 were sent to concentration camps. Only 3 survived the war. This happened over and over. Civilian networks, because they lacked professional security protocols, were vulnerable in ways official circuits sometimes weren't. They were brave beyond measure, but bravery couldn't overcome security failures. And here's the psychological horror. Survivors lived with crushing guilt. The knowledge that their network's collapse had condemned neighbors, friends, family. Some of those who survived physically never recovered psychologically. We also need to acknowledge a darker element, collaboration. Not everyone in occupied territories resisted. Some actively collaborated with German authorities, and collaborators were deadly to civilian networks. A collaborator embedded in a community was almost impossible to detect. They'd lived there for years, had established relationships, seemed trustworthy. When they informed on resistance activities, networks dissolved overnight. One account from Norway describes a civilian network that operated successfully for over a year. Dock workers passing U-boat intelligence to resistance coordinators, effective, cautious, smart. Then mass arrests, the entire network, 23 people, captured simultaneously. The betrayer? A dock foreman who'd been part of the network from the beginning. A man everyone trusted. He'd been informing for months, building German files on every member. When the Gestapo finally moved, they knew everything: meeting locations, communication methods, courier routes, hiding places. The aftermath was devastating, not just the executions, but the community trauma. How do you trust anyone after that? How do you rebuild when betrayal came from within? Many networks never recovered from compromises like these. The survivors retreated into isolation, the communities fractured. The Germans achieved, through betrayal, what they couldn't accomplish through force alone. But here's the remarkable thing. Some networks did rebuild. Survivors found each other, established new protocols, continued operating. The determination was almost superhuman. Why? What drove people to risk everything again after watching their networks destroyed? Let me propose a framework for understanding civilian resistance that rarely appears in histories. Call it the mathematics of occupation. From the German perspective, occupation was a resource calculation. X number of troops to control Y population. Minimal resources, maximum control. The equation worked as long as the population remained passive. But civilian intelligence networks altered that equation fundamentally. Every civilian operative didn't just gather intelligence, they forced German forces to expend resources on security, counterintelligence, surveillance. A single effective network could occupy the attention of entire Gestapo sections. Multiple networks across a region made occupation drastically more expensive. Think of it economically. Germany needed occupation to be profitable, extracting resources, labor, industrial capacity from conquered territories. But if you have to assign thousands of soldiers to guard railways because civilian railway workers are sabotaging them, that's a net loss. If you need massive counterintelligence operations to combat civilian networks, that's a net loss. If your troops are demoralized and paranoid because they can't trust anyone, that's a net loss. Civilian networks created what modern military theory calls strategic bleeding, sustained, low-level resistance that drains occupier resources without triggering overwhelming retaliation. It's the difference between a massive uprising that gets crushed versus persistent erosion that never stops. This mathematics explains something historians have struggled with: why German occupation became increasingly brutal and unstable despite apparent military control. They held the territory but couldn't pacify it. Every tightening of control created new resistance. Every reprisal hardened resolve. They were caught in a negative spiral where more violence generated more resistance, requiring more violence, generating more resistance. Civilian intelligence networks were a major driver of that spiral. They made occupation unsustainable not through dramatic military victories, but through relentless daily pressure that never let up. One German report from 1944 estimated they needed to triple garrison forces in occupied territories to achieve adequate security. Triple. They didn't have those forces. They were bleeding to death on the Eastern Front. So occupation security degraded, civilian networks expanded, the spiral accelerated. By late 1944, some occupied territories were nominally German-controlled but functionally ungovernable. Civilian resistance had created zones of shadow autonomy where the occupation existed in name only. That's the strategic impact of ordinary people refusing to comply. So why don't we know these stories? Why are civilian intelligence networks largely absent from mainstream histories of World War II? The answers are complicated and frankly often uncomfortable. Post-war histories were written primarily by military institutions and official agencies. They had institutional biases toward institutional stories. SOE operations are well documented because SOE kept records, organized archives, promoted their achievements. Official spy agencies had budgets for historical documentation. Civilian networks had none of that. No archives, no official recognition. Many participants didn't survive. Those who did often stayed silent. A lifetime of secrecy doesn't end easily. Their stories existed only in fragmented testimonies, scattered memoirs, local oral histories. When historians wrote the official history of World War II espionage, they naturally gravitated toward documented, organized official operations. Civilian networks fell through the cracks. But there's something else, something more troubling. Acknowledging the effectiveness of civilian resistance undermines certain post-war narratives about military professionalism and state power. If ordinary people with no training or resources could conduct successful intelligence operations, what does that say about the vast military intelligence apparatus? It suggests that resistance doesn't require permission, that individuals can make strategic impacts without official sanction, that expertise and training, while valuable, aren't prerequisites for effective action. Those implications make institutions uncomfortable. So civilian networks got minimized in official histories, not through deliberate suppression, more through passive neglect. They just didn't make it into the standard narrative. But the neglect is starting to change. Recent decades have seen increasing historical interest in resistance studies. Academics are excavating these local archives, family papers, survivor testimonies. The picture they're uncovering is revolutionary. These weren't peripheral players. They were central to the resistance ecosystem. Their contributions weren't minor footnotes. They were strategic game changers. And the more we dig, the more we realize how incomplete our understanding of World War II resistance has been. But here's a question that should haunt us. How many other stories are we missing? How many other civilians made critical contributions that history never recorded? For every network we've discovered, how many vanished completely because nobody documented their existence? The silence around civilian networks isn't just a historical oversight, it's an ongoing failure to recognize that resistance takes many forms, that courage doesn't always wear a uniform, that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people whose names appear in no official records. Let me show you what we're only now beginning to understand about how widespread this phenomenon actually was. When you start mapping civilian intelligence networks across occupied Europe, a stunning pattern emerges. They were everywhere, absolutely everywhere, not just in a few scattered locations, but threaded through every occupied territory like an invisible web. France had hundreds of independent civilian networks, not affiliated with the major resistance organizations like Combat or Franc-Tireur, not coordinated by de Gaulle's Free French, just local people organizing themselves, creating their own intelligence-gathering systems. In Brittany, fishing communities developed sophisticated naval intelligence networks. Fishermen documented German naval activities, noting submarine movements, convoy patterns, minefield locations. They couldn't communicate directly with London, so they passed intelligence through a chain that eventually reached Britain via neutral vessels operating out of Spanish ports. Think about the operational complexity. A Breton fisherman spots a U-boat pack assembling. He can't radio London, he has no radio. Can't send a letter, German censorship would catch it. Instead, he passes the information to another fisherman who trades with Spanish boats. That fisherman gives it to a Spanish contact who has connections in Lisbon. In Lisbon, it reaches British intelligence through diplomatic channels, from observation to Allied command, maybe 2 weeks passing through a dozen hands across 3 countries. And it worked, multiple times. German naval operations were compromised by networks so distributed that the Germans never identified them as networks at all. In Lyon, silk workers created an intelligence system embedded in their industry. Lyon had been a silk production center for centuries. German uniforms, flags, and decorative materials required silk. The workers who produced it documented every order, what units, what quantities, what specifications. That information revealed German military organization, unit strengths, even operational intentions based on material requests. One order for cold weather gear for 20,000 troops, that signals preparation for winter operations, specifications for desert camouflage, deployment to North Africa. The Germans were literally telling the resistance their plans through procurement orders. Belgium, despite its small size, hosted some of the war's most effective civilian networks. The country's position made it a crucial logistics hub. Railways, roads, canals all converged there. German military traffic flowed through Belgium constantly, and Belgian civilians documented everything. The canal barge operators were particularly brilliant. Barges moved continuously through Belgium's extensive waterway system. The operators knew every kilometre, every lock, every depot. When Germans commandeered barges for military transport, the operators couldn't refuse, but they could observe. One barge captain, we'll call him Henry, moved German cargo for 3 years. He knew what he carried, where it came from, where it was going. He maintained detailed mental logs of every shipment, because writing anything down meant death if discovered. Every few weeks he'd meet with a network coordinator and recite his observations. Dates, cargoes, destinations, unit markings, everything memorized with precision that would impress professional intelligence officers. Henry's network provided intelligence that helped partisan groups plan sabotage operations against German supply lines, bridges blown at precise moments to disrupt specific shipments, warehouses raided because civilians knew exactly what was stored there. The Germans never understood how partisans always seemed to know which targets mattered most. The answer? Civilians like Henri moving through the occupation with perfect cover, documenting everything, feeding that intelligence to people who could act on it. Belgian shopkeepers developed another ingenious system. Many German soldiers stationed in Belgium wanted to send packages home, souvenirs, gifts, personal items. Local post offices and shipping companies handled this traffic. The employees who processed those packages, well, they opened them first. Not every package, that would be too dangerous. But selective inspection revealed remarkable intelligence. Photographs German soldiers took showed unit locations, equipment, fortifications. Letters home described morale, combat experiences, supply situations. Even the souvenirs themselves, shell casings, uniform insignia, captured equipment, revealed what units had been in combat, where, against whom. The Netherlands presented unique challenges: flat, densely populated, heavily garrisoned, harder terrain for traditional resistance. But Dutch civilians adapted brilliantly. The medical networks were extraordinary. Dutch nurses and doctors had access to German military hospitals. They treated wounded soldiers, processed medical records, observed casualty rates. That information told stories about combat intensity, unit effectiveness, even operational planning. A Dutch nurse working in a German military hospital in Rotterdam kept mental notes on casualty admissions. Sudden spike in frostbite cases. Units recently deployed from Eastern Front. Increase in tropical disease treatments, troops returning from North Africa. She never wrote anything down, never took physical evidence, just observed, remembered, and passed information through her network every few weeks. That medical intelligence helped Allied command understand German force dispositions and movement patterns. When casualty rates for specific units suddenly decreased, it suggested those units had been withdrawn for rest or redeployment. When they increased, it indicated active combat operations. A nurse's observations became strategic intelligence. Dutch railway workers, like their French counterparts, created sophisticated networks. But the Dutch added an innovation: they coordinated across the entire national rail system. Station masters in Amsterdam communicated with operators in The Hague, who connected with engineers in Rotterdam, creating a real-time intelligence network that tracked German logistics across the country. The Germans never realized the entire Dutch railway system was effectively an Allied intelligence asset. The very infrastructure they depended on for military logistics was documenting their every move. Norway's geography created different opportunities: long coastlines, deep fjords, scattered communities, ideal for independent networks operating in isolation. Norwegian coastal watchers were legendary. Living in remote fishing villages, they had perfect observation posts for German naval operations. U-boats using fjord bases, surface vessels moving along the coast, even aircraft activity, all documented by civilians who knew every nautical mile of their territory. One Norwegian lighthouse keeper spent 4 years documenting every German vessel that passed his position. He couldn't transmit intelligence, no radio, too remote for courier networks. So he kept encoded logs hidden in his lighthouse, planning to deliver them when liberation came. When Allied forces finally reached his location in 1945, he presented 4 years of meticulously detailed observations: dates, times, vessel types, headings, activities. That historical intelligence helped post-war analysts reconstruct German naval operations in Norwegian waters with remarkable accuracy. He'd risked everything for intelligence he couldn't even transmit just because he believed it mattered. That's dedication beyond comprehension. Norwegian teachers created another remarkable network. Many worked in areas heavily garrisoned by German troops. They incorporated intelligence gathering into their daily routines, observing troop movements during walks to school, noting vehicle types while supervising children's recess, documenting construction activities visible from classroom windows. The intelligence wasn't dramatic: no stolen documents, no photographed secrets, just patient, daily observation. But aggregated across dozens of teachers in different locations, it created comprehensive pictures of German force disposition and activity patterns. What's fascinating is how these civilian networks evolved their methods over time. They learned from mistakes, adapted to German countermeasures, developed increasingly sophisticated techniques. It was intelligence tradecraft evolution in real time. Early in the war, civilian networks struggled with communication. How do you pass intelligence when you can't use phones, mail is censored, and travel is restricted? Initial solutions were crude, dead drops, brief encounters in crowded spaces, coded notes hidden in routine correspondence. But they got better. Much better. One French network developed a system using public library book returns. Members would borrow books, insert coded messages on specific pages, return the books. Other members would borrow those same books, retrieve the messages, respond by inserting their own notes before returning them. The library catalogue became a communication network with built-in security. Messages automatically destroyed when books were reborrowed by genuine patrons. The Germans never caught on because it looked exactly like normal library activity. No suspicious meetings, no dead drops, no intercepted messages. Just people borrowing and returning books. Another network used classified ads in local newspapers. They'd place seemingly innocent ads. For sale, bicycle, good condition. Or wanted, sewing machine, with coded information embedded in the text. The price indicated date and time. Item description specified location. Whether it was for sale or wanted determined whether the message was positive or negative intelligence. The Germans monitored newspapers for coded messages, but they looked for complex codes in the news articles themselves. They never thought to analyze the classified ads because who would hide military intelligence in mundane advertisements? That's the civilian advantage again, weaponizing the utterly ordinary in ways professional spies wouldn't think of because they're trained to think in terms of sophisticated techniques. Here's something counterintuitive. Lack of training was sometimes an advantage. Professional agents had patterns, techniques, methodologies that counterintelligence agencies knew how to detect. Civilians, making it up as they went, created unpredictable patterns that were harder to recognize. A trained agent knows the proper way to conduct a dead drop, specific timing, specific procedures, specific precautions. Those procedures create patterns. Patterns can be detected. A civilian who decides to hide microfilm in a flower delivery makes it up based on what seems logical in their context. There's no pattern because there's no standardization. Every civilian network invented its own methods based on their specific circumstances and opportunities. The Gestapo trained to catch professional spies. They knew what to look for, certain behaviors, certain techniques, certain inconsistencies. But how do you catch someone who isn't following any known playbook? Someone who's improvising based on local knowledge and daily routine? You can't. Not easily. Which is why civilian networks often survived longer than professional circuits that should have been more secure. One Dutch network operated for the entire occupation, 1940 to 1945. 5 years of continuous intelligence operations. They weren't more careful than professional networks, they weren't more skilled, they were just more unpredictable. Their methods kept evolving based on what worked in practice, rather than what training manuals said should work. By war's end, they'd developed techniques that professional intelligence agencies studied and incorporated into post-war training. The amateurs became teachers. Civilian networks also got better at security. Early networks were often too trusting, recruiting too quickly, sharing too much information, failing to compartmentalize properly. German counterintelligence destroyed many networks by exploiting these weaknesses. Survivors learned. Later networks had brutally strict security protocols. Some rules that emerged: never recruit anyone you haven't known for years. No exceptions. If someone volunteers to join, automatically suspect them. Genuine recruitment happens slowly through extended observation and careful vetting. Never know more than necessary. If you're a courier, you don't know what you're carrying. If you're an observer, you don't know who receives your intelligence. If you're a coordinator, you never meet field operatives personally. Everyone operates behind layers of ignorance that protect the network if they're captured. These weren't official protocols, they were lessons written in blood. Every compromised network taught survivors what not to do. By 1943 to 44, civilian networks in some regions had security practices that would impress modern intelligence agencies. One Belgian network had a rule: if you suspect compromise even slightly, you burn everything and vanish. No attempts to investigate, no trying to save the network, no warning others, just disappear. It sounds paranoid and ruthless. It also kept that network operational when others around it were destroyed. They understood something crucial: better to preserve yourself and rebuild than to risk the entire network trying to save compromised elements. That's professional-level operational security from people who'd never received a day of formal training. We need to talk specifically about women's networks because they represent some of the most remarkable intelligence operations of the war, and they've been systematically underrepresented in historical accounts. German occupation forces had massive blind spots regarding women. Cultural assumptions, institutional sexism, sheer underestimation. Women were consistently treated as non-threatening. That perception was devastating to German security. A woman could move through checkpoints with less scrutiny, could ask questions that would be suspicious from a man but seemed innocent from her, could access spaces, hospitals, schools, private homes that men couldn't, could gather intelligence in plain sight while German soldiers literally looked past her. Women exploited this ruthlessly, and I mean that as highest praise. They turned sexist assumptions into operational weapons that German counterintelligence never figured out how to counter. Let me give you a specific example. A network of French seamstresses, women who altered and repaired German uniforms, photographed literally hundreds of documents found in German officers' pockets: ID cards, orders, maps, correspondence. German officers were so comfortable around seamstresses that they didn't even empty their pockets before handing over uniforms. The seamstresses would carefully remove documents, photograph them with miniature cameras hidden in their sewing equipment, return them to the pockets, and deliver the photographs to resistance coordinators. For over 2 years, this network compromised German security at a fundamental level because officers couldn't imagine seamstresses as intelligence threats. One seamstress, Marguerite, her real name lost to history, reportedly photographed documents from 17 different German officers. None ever suspected her. She was just the pleasant, middle-aged woman who did excellent alterations and never asked questions. What she actually was: an intelligence operative who compromised German operational security dozens of times. Housewives created some of the most sophisticated intelligence networks of the war. Their daily routines, shopping, socializing, managing households, provided perfect cover for intelligence operations. Women's social networks became intelligence-sharing systems. Morning coffee gatherings weren't just social occasions, they were briefings where observations were shared and intelligence coordinated. A woman who'd seen troop movements while shopping tells her friends, another who'd overheard German soldiers talking at the market adds details, a third, who works at the train station, confirms the information. They assemble a complete intelligence picture over coffee and pastries. German authorities never paid attention to women's coffee gatherings because they seemed utterly harmless, just housewives chatting. What could be threatening about that? Everything, as it turned out. Those chat sessions produced military intelligence that reached Allied command through longer courier chains. The Germans had no idea that their troop movements were being documented by women discussing recipes. One particularly brilliant network used knitting patterns as encoding systems. Different stitch combinations represented letters and numbers. A woman could sit in a cafe knitting while German officers talked at the next table and literally encode their conversation into the scarf she was creating. The completed items, scarves, sweaters, blankets, were then donated to resistance families who would unravel them and decode the intelligence. The Germans saw women knitting for the war effort and felt it was appropriately feminine. They never imagined those knitting needles were weapons. Nurses deserve special recognition. They had access to extraordinarily sensitive intelligence through their medical work, and they exploited that access brilliantly. German military hospitals employed local nurses throughout occupied territories. They needed the medical expertise and didn't have enough German nurses for all their facilities. So French, Belgian, Dutch, Norwegian. Nurses treated German wounded, processed medical records, heard conversations between injured soldiers. Those nurses documented everything: unit designations from wounded soldiers' paperwork, combat accounts from delirious patients, casualty rates that revealed intensity of fighting, supply shortages mentioned by German medical staff, equipment lists, personnel rosters, even operational plans discussed by careless officers visiting wounded subordinates. One Dutch nurse worked in a German hospital for 3 years. She memorized information constantly, couldn't write anything down because she was searched regularly. Every few weeks she'd meet with a network coordinator and recite everything she'd learned: names, ranks, units, casualties, medical conditions, conversations, observations. Her intelligence helped Allied analysts track German unit effectiveness, identify units being rotated to and from the Eastern Front, and understand German logistics constraints based on medical supply shortages. She was never caught, worked in that hospital until liberation. The Germans trusted her completely because she was an excellent nurse who showed no signs of resistant sympathy. What she actually was, one of the most productive intelligence sources in the Netherlands. The nursing networks faced unique ethical challenges. They were treating enemies, men who'd occupied their countries, perhaps killed their countrymen. Yet they provided genuine medical care while simultaneously gathering intelligence that would help kill other German soldiers. How do you reconcile that? How do you care for a wounded German soldier in the morning and pass intelligence that might cause his unit's destruction in the afternoon?
I don't have an answer. Neither did many of the nurses, even decades after the war. They just knew that both were necessary.
This is perhaps the most uncomfortable aspect of civilian resistance, but it's essential to understand. Children participated in intelligence networks, not as operatives making decisions, but as couriers, observers, and message carriers. German occupation forces consistently underestimated children. A 10-year-old running errands wasn't suspicious. A teenager delivering packages for their parents' shop seemed harmless. That perception created operational opportunities that resistance networks exploited. Before we continue, let's acknowledge the moral complexity here. Using children in resistance operations was dangerous and ethically fraught. Many network organizers refused to involve minors at all. Others argued that children were already at risk from occupation and deserved the chance to resist. There's no clean answer. War creates impossible ethical situations. This was one of them. That said, children who participated often proved remarkably effective. They moved through German checkpoints with minimal scrutiny, could loiter near military installations without attracting attention. Just kids playing, could deliver messages or small packages without being searched. One Belgian network used teenage couriers extensively, boys and girls 14 to 17 years old, who'd memorized messages or carried microfilm in hollowed-out toys or school supplies. They'd make their deliveries pretending to visit friends or relatives, sometimes traveling significant distances across occupied territory. The psychological burden on these young people must have been crushing. Imagine being 15 years old, carrying intelligence that, if discovered, would get you tortured and executed. Imagine maintaining composure at checkpoints while German soldiers casually searched your bag. Imagine living with that fear daily. Some survived, many didn't. After the war, survivors often struggled with the psychological aftermath, PTSD decades before we had terms for it, guilt over fallen comrades, difficulty adjusting to peace after years of dangerous operations. Children also served as observers. They could watch military installations under the guise of playing nearby, could note vehicle movements, troop activities, construction projects, could report what they'd seen to adult network members who compiled the intelligence. In occupied Poland, a group of children created their own observation network. They designated themselves watchers, tracking German activities in their neighborhood, documenting troop movements, noting new fortifications. They passed their observations to adults in the resistance who compiled them into intelligence reports. These weren't trained operatives, they were kids, 11 to 15 years old, who decided occupation wasn't acceptable and found ways to resist. Their observations contributed to intelligence that informed partisan operations against German positions. The Germans never suspected children of organized intelligence gathering. It never occurred to them that the kids playing football near their supply depot were counting vehicles and memorizing unit markings. That blindness was fatal. Children observed, documented, reported, and German security never adapted because they couldn't conceptualize children as intelligence threats. But the cost was horrific. When children were caught, and some were, German reprisals were brutal. No mercy for age or innocence. If you resisted, you were enemy, regardless of how old you were. The memorial records are heartbreaking. 14-year-old courier executed, 16-year-old observer tortured for network information. Entire families punished because their children participated in resistance. Yet the networks continued because people, including young people, decided that risk was preferable to submission. Let's discuss the practical innovations civilian networks developed, because they created intelligence gathering techniques that were genuinely revolutionary. Professional intelligence agencies had access to sophisticated equipment, miniature cameras, specialized tools, professional development laboratories. Civilian networks had to improvise everything. They became remarkably good at it. One French network built their own miniature camera from watch parts, eyeglass lenses, and modified film from regular cameras. It was crude, barely functional, produced grainy images, but it worked. They photographed documents, maps, orders, hundreds of intelligence items over months of operation. The camera eventually broke, couldn't be repaired. So they developed a new method, meticulously hand-copying documents in microscopic writing, then photographing the copies with a regular camera at extreme magnification. The negatives contained all the information in impossible-to-detect sizes. Belgian civilians developed photographic techniques using household chemicals. No access to proper development equipment, so they experimented with vinegar, salt, various substances, until they found combinations that could develop film. The results were inconsistent but good enough for intelligence work. One network used baking soda and citrus juice as invisible ink, ancient spy technique adapted for modern use. Messages written on ordinary paper, seemingly blank, revealed under heat. Simple, effective, nearly impossible to detect unless you knew to look for it. Civilian networks also developed sophisticated encoding systems, often more practical than official codes because they were designed for amateurs to use under stress. A Dutch network used music notation as cipher. Sheet music that appeared to be folk songs actually contained encoded messages. Musical notes represented letters, timing indicated importance, key signatures provided contextual meaning. German censors never caught on because it looked exactly like what it was: music. Imagine, a German officer confiscates a sheet of music from a woman at a checkpoint, suspicious because she's carrying papers. He examines it, sees folk songs, returns it with an apology. What he held was a complete intelligence report about troop positions in his sector, hidden in plain sight as music. A Norwegian network used knot patterns in fishing nets as encoding. Different knots, different sequences, all conveying information. Fishermen could literally communicate intelligence while performing their normal work under direct German observation without any suspicious activity. The encoding was built into their craft, unbreakable because you'd need to understand both the fishing trade and the specific network's code to recognize that nets contained intelligence. We need to examine a darker element. Some civilian networks operated by penetrating collaborationist organizations. This was resistance at its most psychologically complex. In every occupied country, some citizens collaborated with German authorities, sometimes for ideology, sometimes for profit, sometimes for survival. Collaborationist organizations helped Germans administer occupation, identify resistance members, maintain control. Some resistance networks deliberately infiltrated these organizations. Imagine, you join a collaborationist organization, outwardly supporting the occupation, attending meetings, providing intelligence to Germans. Your neighbors view you as a traitor. Your family may disown you. Everyone thinks you've chosen the enemy's side, but you're actually resistance. Deep cover. Using your access to collaborationist networks to identify German informants, sabotage operations, feed false intelligence, protect resistance members from exposure. That psychological burden is almost unimaginable. You're genuinely betraying the betrayers, but to the outside world, you appear to be exactly what you pretend. The isolation must have been crushing. One French man joined a collaborationist police force, worked for them for 2 years, seemingly a committed collaborator. His actual role, warning resistance members before raids, altering files to protect people under suspicion, feeding misinformation to German handlers about resistance activities. He was eventually exposed, not by Germans but by resistance members who didn't know he was one of them and targeted him as a collaborator. Barely escaped execution by fellow resistance fighters. Even after his true role was revealed, many never forgave his apparent collaboration. The moral complexity is staggering. He saved dozens of resistance members through his infiltration, but to do so, he had to commit genuine acts of collaboration, arresting resistance suspects to maintain cover, providing some real intelligence to maintain credibility. Where's the line between necessary deception and actual betrayal? How do you maintain moral identity while pretending to be someone morally reprehensible? Some infiltrators went even deeper, joining German intelligence services themselves, becoming the very thing they opposed to destroy it from within. A Belgian woman worked as a secretary for German counterintelligence in Brussels. She typed reports about resistance activities, filed intelligence on suspected operatives, processed interrogation summaries. The Germans trusted her completely, loyal, efficient, never questioning. She was resistance. Everything she saw, she memorized and passed to her network. Reports about German intelligence operations, names of suspected resistance members, allowing networks to warn those people. Investigation plans, letting resistance stay ahead of German counterintelligence. For 18 months, she sat in the heart of German intelligence operations in Belgium, documenting their every move. When she was finally extracted before the liberation, she brought with her the most comprehensive overview of German counterintelligence operations any resistance network had compiled. But consider the psychological cost. Daily interaction with Gestapo officers, typing up torture reports, processing execution orders. She had to perform efficiency and loyalty while documenting horrors that would haunt her forever. She survived the war, but according to post-war accounts, never fully recovered psychologically. How could she? How does anyone recover from that level of sustained deception and horror? As the war entered its final phase, civilian intelligence networks faced new challenges and opportunities. The approaching liberation changed everything. By late 1944, Allied forces were advancing. Liberation was coming. For civilian networks, this created paradoxical pressures. Success was imminent, but danger intensified. German forces became increasingly desperate and brutal. Reprisals for resistance activities escalated. Security operations intensified. Just when liberation seemed close enough to touch, the occupation became more dangerous than ever. Civilian networks had to make impossible calculations, continue operations when capture meant certain death just weeks or months before liberation, or cease activities knowing that intelligence could save lives but risking everything when freedom was so close. Most continued. The mathematical resistance we discussed earlier, that calculus of occupation cost, became even more urgent. Every piece of intelligence could potentially shorten the war, save lives, bring liberation sooner. A French postal network continued operations until the literal day of liberation. Their final intelligence report documented German troop positions that morning. They delivered it to Allied forces as those forces entered their town. Hours later, they were free. Hours earlier, they were risking execution. Why continue that close to the end? Because they could. Because the mission still mattered. Because surrender, even when victory was imminent, was unacceptable. Civilian networks played crucial roles during liberation operations themselves. They had current intelligence about German positions, knew which routes were safe, could identify collaborators who might cause problems during the transition. In many towns, civilian networks essentially prepared the ground for Allied arrival, marking safe approach routes, identifying remaining German positions, preparing local resistance to secure key locations before Allied forces arrived. Allied commanders entering newly liberated territories often found remarkably detailed intelligence waiting for them, maps of German positions, lists of collaborators, inventories of available supplies, all prepared by civilian networks operating up until the moment of liberation. One Dutch town presented Allied forces with a complete dossier on every German position, every booby trap, every landmine in the area, information compiled over months by civilian observers who documented everything while appearing to live normal lives under occupation. That intelligence saved lives. Allied forces could advance more quickly, avoid traps, secure areas efficiently because civilians had already done the reconnaissance. But liberation brought new complications. Some civilian network members faced suspicion because their resistance activities had been so covert that even their neighbors didn't know. People who'd risked everything for years suddenly had to prove their resistance credentials to communities that viewed them as passive or even collaborationist. The infiltrators we discussed earlier had it worst. Those who joined collaborationist organizations as deep, cover-faced accusations, trials, sometimes violence from people who couldn't or wouldn't accept their true roles. Liberation justice was often swift and brutal, with little room for nuance. What happened to these civilian operatives after the war? The answer is complex and often tragic. Many stayed silent about their activities. Decades of silence, they'd been trained, self-trained, to never speak about their work. That conditioning didn't end with liberation. Some genuinely couldn't talk about it. The psychological trauma was too deep. Others felt their contributions didn't matter compared to military operations. Some were told to stay silent by governments that didn't want to acknowledge the extent of civilian resistance. A Belgian woman who'd operated a safe house for resistance members for 4 years never told her own children. They discovered her war activities only after her death, finding hidden documents and correspondence she'd never mentioned. 40 years of silence about experiences that had defined her life. A Dutch postal worker who'd intercepted and copied German correspondence for 3 years went back to his job after liberation and never mentioned his resistance work. Colleagues who worked beside him for decades had no idea. He died in 1987, his intelligence contributions unknown except to a handful of surviving network members. This silence was partly security conditioning. Don't talk about operations even after they're over. Partly trauma, the experiences were too painful to discuss. Partly modesty, they genuinely didn't think what they'd done was remarkable, but it also reflects something darker. Post-war societies weren't always ready to acknowledge civilian resistance contributions. The official narrative focused on military operations, government-sanctioned resistance organizations, dramatic combat actions. Quiet intelligence gathering by ordinary civilians didn't fit that narrative. After the war, official recognition went primarily to organized resistance groups and military units. SOE agents received medals, commemorations, official histories. Civilians who'd operated independently often received nothing. Some countries made efforts. France established medals for resistance participants. But the criteria often required affiliation with recognized organizations. Civilians who'd operated independently, who'd deliberately stayed off official rosters for security, couldn't prove their participation. Imagine, you spent years risking your life gathering intelligence. Maybe you lost family members. Maybe you were tortured. Maybe you saw your network destroyed and rebuilt it from nothing. And after liberation, you received no recognition because you can't prove your activities through official channels. This happened to thousands of civilian operatives. Their contributions were real, significant, sometimes strategically crucial. But because they'd operated off the books, they had no documentation, no official acknowledgement, no place in the historical record. A Norwegian teacher who'd coordinated an observation network for 3 years applied for veteran recognition in the 1950s. Denied. She couldn't prove her resistance activity because her network had deliberately left no paper trail. Her fellow network members testified, but without official documentation, the government concluded she didn't qualify. She died in 1972, officially a civilian with no war service. Actually one of the most effective intelligence coordinators in her region, This pattern repeated across Europe. The very security practices that had kept civilian networks safe during occupation made them invisible to post-war recognition systems. Why does any of this matter today? Why should we care about civilian intelligence networks from a war that ended 80 years ago? Because the lessons are timeless, the patterns are universal, and the implications are profound for how we understand resistance, courage, and individual agency. These civilian networks prove something revolutionary. Ordinary people, with no special training or resources, can significantly impact major historical events. Not just participate, impact. Shape outcomes, change trajectories. That's fundamentally threatening to power structures that depend on the narrative that major change requires official sanction, professional expertise, institutional support. The civilian networks of World War II demonstrate that distributed amateur resistance can be as effective, sometimes more effective, than organized professional operations. That's a dangerous idea for any authoritarian system because it suggests that control is more fragile than it appears. If housewives can bring down occupation through intelligence networks, what else can ordinary citizens accomplish? If bakers and postal workers can compromise military security, what other established powers are vulnerable to distributed resistance? These questions don't just apply to military occupation. They apply to any system that depends on citizen passivity for its survival. Modern examples abound: digital activists exposing corruption, citizen journalists documenting abuse, whistleblower networks challenging corporate or government malfeasance. The mechanics are different, but the principle is identical. Ordinary people, leveraging their unique positions and everyday activities, can generate significant impact. There's another modern parallel that's deeply relevant: surveillance and privacy. Civilian networks succeeded partly by weaponizing privacy, keeping their activities hidden in plain sight, using encryption, codes, compartmentalizing information. Today, those same principles apply to digital privacy, and resistance to surveillance. The techniques are different, but the fundamental tension is identical: individuals versus systems, privacy versus control, resistance versus submission. The civilian networks teach us that privacy isn't just personal, it's political. Your ability to think, organize, and act without surveillance is fundamentally about power. Who controls information controls outcomes. German occupation forces failed partly because they couldn't surveil everything. Civilian networks exploited that surveillance gap. Today, technology has created new surveillance capabilities, but also new privacy tools. The battle continues with the same fundamental stakes. The civilian operatives who hid intelligence in bread loaves would recognize modern encrypted communications as the same principle updated for new technology. Hiding vital information in plain sight, making surveillance prohibitively difficult, maintaining private spaces where resistance can organize. Perhaps the most valuable lessons from civilian networks are psychological. How do ordinary people find courage to resist overwhelming power? What enables sustained action despite crushing fear? Courage, these networks demonstrate, isn't the absence of fear, it's action despite fear. Every civilian operative was terrified. The accounts make that clear. Constant grinding fear that never disappeared. But they acted anyway. Not because they were fearless, but because they'd made calculations that transcended fear. Here's the pattern. Courage emerges when your calculation of what matters exceeds your calculation of personal risk. When protecting your community, your family, your values becomes more important than preserving your safety. And that's not mystical, it's mathematical. Emotional mathematics perhaps, but mathematics nonetheless. A Belgian shopkeeper continues intelligence work despite fear because his calculation is simple. The occupation's cost to his community exceeds his personal risk. A Dutch nurse maintains her network because saving lives through intelligence matters more than her safety. These aren't heroes in the Hollywood sense, fearless, confident, invulnerable. They're people who decided certain things mattered more than their own survival and acted on that decision despite constant terror. That's replicable, not easy, not comfortable, but replicable. Any person in any context can make those calculations, can decide what matters enough to accept risk, can act on those decisions. The civilian networks prove it's possible because thousands of ordinary people did exactly that. Another crucial lesson: resistance isn't individual, it's communal. The civilian networks succeeded because they were built on existing community relationships, trust networks, shared identity. You couldn't parachute into a community and create those networks from scratch. They emerged from years, sometimes generations, of relationship building. That foundation made them resilient. Modern applications are obvious. Want to create resilient communities capable of collective action. Build relationships now. Establish trust networks before you need them. Create social architecture that can support resistance when circumstances demand it. The civilian networks didn't form after occupation began. They emerged from communities that already existed, repurposing existing relationships for resistance purposes. This is true for any collective challenge. Climate action, social justice, democratic defense all require community foundations built before crisis arrives. The networks teach us that you can't create community during emergency. You can only activate community that already exists. Build now, connect now, establish trust now. Because when you need that network, there won't be time to create it from scratch. We've covered a lot. But here's the reality. This story is incomplete. Vast portions remain undocumented, unknown, maybe unknowable. How many networks operated completely off the books and left zero record? How many individuals gathered intelligence, passed it along, made genuine contributions that history never captured? We'll never know. The nature of civilian networks, their deliberate invisibility, their lack of documentation, their security through anonymity, means much of their story disappeared with the participants. Every network we've discussed represents discovered history. But what about the networks we haven't discovered? The operations that succeeded so perfectly they left no trace. The individuals who contributed crucially but told no one. History is always incomplete, but civilian resistance is particularly prone to historical erasure. Success meant invisibility. Survival often meant silence. The most effective operations are potentially the least documented, and that's simultaneously frustrating and inspiring. Frustrating because we can't fully understand the phenomenon. Inspiring because it suggests civilian resistance was even more extensive than we know. The networks we've examined might be just the tip of the iceberg, a hint of a vast, mostly invisible resistance ecosystem that operated throughout occupied Europe. New information continues to emerge. Family members find hidden documents. Archives release classified material. Survivors, in their final years, decide to break their silence. Each discovery adds to the picture. A French family cleaning out their grandmother's attic in 2018 found encoded letters documenting her intelligence work. She'd never mentioned it. Died in 1993, taking her silence to the grave. But the letters survived, revealing decades of hidden history. How many more stories are waiting in attics, basements, forgotten filing cabinets? How many surviving participants are still silent, holding histories that will disappear with them? This is an active historical frontier. Researchers are racing against time, trying to document civilian resistance before the last survivors pass and their memories vanish forever. If you had family in occupied Europe during World War II, you might be sitting on undiscovered history, documents hidden away, stories never told, evidence of contributions that changed the war. The history books present World War II as settled, complete, thoroughly documented. They're wrong. We're still discovering how it actually happened, still learning who actually fought it, still uncovering the hidden networks that helped win it. So here's my final question. What do we owe these people? The seamstresses and postal workers and bakers who risked everything, the housewives who encoded intelligence in knitting patterns, the children who served as couriers, the teachers who coordinated networks while teaching classes. At minimum, we owe them recognition. Acknowledgement that their contributions mattered. That history wasn't just made by soldiers and government agents. That ordinary people shaped outcomes through extraordinary courage, but maybe we owe them more. Maybe we owe them action. Maybe we owe them the commitment to remember that resistance is possible, that individuals can impact events. That power is never as absolute as it appears. That courage can emerge from anywhere. The civilian intelligence networks of World War II aren't just historical curiosities. They're proof of concept. Evidence that distributed civilian-led resistance can challenge even overwhelming power. That's a lesson worth preserving, worth teaching, worth remembering when modern authoritarianism rises, when surveillance expands, when individual rights compress. The bakers and postal workers and seamstresses faced the most powerful military machine in human history, and they resisted, successfully, using nothing but courage, creativity, and community. If they could do that, what could we do if circumstances demanded it? The woman with the breadbasket at the German checkpoint, remember her from the beginning. She was real. Dozens like her were real, hundreds, thousands. Moving intelligence through occupied Europe in hollowed-out bread loaves, wine bottles, knitting bags, children's toys. The Germans never figured out how Allied intelligence always seemed to know their movements, how partisan groups always seemed one step ahead, how resistance networks survived despite intensive counterintelligence operations. Part of the answer is these networks, civilian networks operating completely off the books, invented from scratch by ordinary people who decided occupation wasn't acceptable. Their story challenges everything we think we know about resistance, courage, and historical agency. It proves that you don't need to be special to make a difference. You need to care enough to act, need to be creative enough to improvise, need to be brave enough to continue despite fear. Those qualities aren't rare, they're human, universal, dormant in millions until circumstances activate them. The civilian intelligence networks of World War II activated those qualities in housewives, bakers, postal workers, teachers, nurses, shopkeepers. People who'd never imagined themselves as resistance fighters became exactly that. Their legacy isn't just historical, it's immediate, present, relevant. Because the next time someone tells you ordinary people can't change history, you'll know better. You'll know about the networks, the seamstresses photographing documents, the railway workers tracking troop movements, the bakers hiding intelligence in bread, the housewives encoding messages in knitting patterns. You'll know that history isn't just made by the people in the official records, it's made by everyone who decides to resist, to contribute, to fight back in whatever ways their circumstances allow. That's the real story. Not just what happened during World War II, but what's possible. Always. Everywhere.
The networks proved it. Ordinary people, extraordinary impact.
Remember that, because someday that knowledge might matter.